Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Johnson, and welcome to week 6. Week 6, we are going to be looking at adolescence, and by the end of this, you should be able to identify nutrients that are important for this lifespan and factors that might impact those choices. And then we're also going to be discussing the various eating disorders, as this is a prime time when a lot of those food relationships are developed. So I want you to kind of ask yourself why healthy eating is important for teenagers. And then I want you to think back to when you were a teenager and were you concerned about eating healthy? Some may have, but others might not even occur to them that they're forming eating patterns that are going to then follow them into their adult life. During adolescence, we have another growth spurt and height increases significantly. Weight also increases, and it's going to be a little different for a female versus a male. One of the things that is growing mostly is a large amount of bone mass and muscle in males and body fat in females. Due to hormonal changes, women are going to be carrying more body fat, whereas the boys are going to have more muscle. Now, these hormonal changes do impact how people view their own bodies, which would be something that we might refer to as body image, that can also then impact their food choices. It's important to understand that during this lifespan, there is a desire for independence. A lot of these teenagers are starting to drive or they're out with their friends on their own. So that means they're making their own food choices, and they might even have more opportunity to go into a fast food restaurant or different types of foods that may not be as nourishing. Another big influential factor here is peer and media influences. This can lead to really bad or damaging habits. A lot of the times, information in the media is skewed, and they don't necessarily have the developmental ability to understand that a lot of these pictures and images have been filtered, and then as well as some of the content may not be true. Overall, when we're looking at teenagers, eating a healthy balance is important. A healthy, balanced diet is important to promote overall well-being and health. This can then improve their mood and self-esteem. Eating an adequate dietary intake also can boost concentration, which is important in high school if they plan to go on to have any type of a career or college. This can later help them reduce their risk of chronic diseases, and then as well as in the short term can reduce days off, and this can increase productivity for them. One thing to note is that failure to consume an adequate diet during the teenage years can delay the sexual maturity of our hormones coming in. So this is something that we want to make sure that we can balance out. Now I want to show you at the top here, this compares females and males ages 9 all the way to 30, but we want to look at just the 9 to 13 and 14 to 18 for females and males. It's relatively equal, where calories per day is roughly 2,000. The big difference here is when we go from the 9 to 13 up to the 14 to 18, we see almost 1,000 calorie increase for the males, whereas for the females, we don't see that large of an increase. This is due to those hormonal changes as I previously discussed. Another thing I want to note is the difference between iron. I don't have this one highlighted, so I apologize. You're going to have to follow the mouse. So iron listed here, I want to show you that for females, you start at 8 milligrams per day. It goes up to 15 and then all the way up to 18 milligrams per day. This is largely different compared to the male, who starts at 8 milligrams, goes up to 11 milligrams, and then drops down to 8 milligrams per day. What may the relationship between iron needs being higher for females compared to the males? Like, what is the female experiencing during these ages that would require her to have additional iron compared to her male at the same age? If you guessed her menstrual cycle, you are correct. She's losing blood every single month, and iron is one of the biggest elements in our blood, such as those things called hemoglobin. So it's important that you get extra iron for females. So let's review a couple of nutrients of concern that are important during this life stage. The first one, as I mentioned, is iron. The onset of the menstrual cycle for the female increases the iron needs for females. Foods that are rich in iron tend to be your protein foods, specifically beef. Oftentimes, females are not consuming, 1, enough calories, and then 2, enough protein, which ultimately means they're typically lacking enough iron in their diet. Inadequate iron stores can then result in anemia. Calcium. Calcium is another important nutrient because half of your bone mass accumulates during adolescency. So we continue to form new bone until about the age of 30, and then we stop contributing and making new bone, and rather we just maintain whatever bone formation that we had for the first 30 years of our life. Now, a typical average adult is going to need about 1,000 milligrams per day, where this age range is going to need 1,300 milligrams per day. That equals about 4 cups of dairy per day. Now, it doesn't always have to be dairy. However, it is important to note that the richest source of calcium foods do come from your dairy products, things like milk, cheese, and yogurt. Whereas your dark leafy greens are good sources of calcium, but they don't quite have as much as those dairy-based products. For a female who chooses, or a male who chooses to not consume dairy products for whatever particular reason, it's important to make sure that they are getting the fortified non-dairy substitutes. Vitamin A is another critical nutrient during this lifespan. It plays an important role in reproduction, growth, and it also boosts your immune system. Here are some foods listed that are high in vitamin A. The richest sources are those orange pigmented vegetables such as carrots and sweet potatoes. Finally, vitamin E is an essential nutrient because it acts as an antioxidant. You might be asking yourself, what the heck is an antioxidant? Well, inside of our bodies, when we are growing and any day-to-day activity, we produce these things called free radicals. These free radicals over time can develop into tumors, which then the tumors can become cancerous. We want to neutralize or basically get rid of that free radical, and the way we do that is by consuming antioxidants. So vitamin E is a very good antioxidant for this reason, and teens are typically not consuming enough vitamin E. So when we're looking at obesity, one thing we want to look at is what are some of the short-term complications of obesity for teenagers. Most of it has to do with psychological problems, which could become a long-term issue. Poor self-esteem, bullying, they're not going to want to go to class, and it can ultimately result in a long-term. But other long-term complications are increased chronic disease, such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Therefore, it's important that we can address teenage obesity because the majority of obese adolescents will remain obese into adulthood. So I want you to think about this for a second and put yourself in the position of a teenager. Do you believe there is an ideal body weight? When should someone be concerned about dieting obsession? What foods are people likely to binge on? And how many magazines, articles, or media promote dieting or encourage thinness? Due to this complication of fighting obesity as well as trying to maintain health, the Academy of Pediatrics came out with new guidelines in August of 2015. They stated that we as a nation need to address both teen obesity and eating disorders. And we need to primarily do this by moving away from weight talk and instead helping kids have a healthy relationship with food and their bodies. There's a lot of strategies that I'm going to share with you throughout the next couple slides of what we can do. But first I want to talk about some of the risk with disordered eating and ultimately eating disorders. So here are some statistics. Over half of teenage girls and a third of teenage boys will use some type of unhealthy behavior to control their weight. These unhealthy behaviors to control your weight could be things like laxatives, diet pills, smoking, alcohol, and a variety of other mechanisms. And the worst part is that 81% of 10-year-olds are afraid of being fat. Why is that? Well, the average woman is 5'4" and weighs 140 pounds. Yet the average supermodel is 5'11" and weighs 117 pounds. Girls are looking at these magazine articles with supermodels who have unrealistic expectations of their body and don't represent the average female. It's the same for the male as well. Males also struggle with disordered eating and body image issues. It's just not talked about as much. Now, it's pretty ironic because Americans spend over $60 billion on dieting and diet-related products each year, yet we continue to be the most obese country. So what is important here is the fact that these diet gimmicks, pills, shakes, and potions are not doing their job, and that's the goal of these food companies that are producing diet products because that's how they make their money. So it's important to teach these healthy relationships with food and body in order to prevent having to go towards dieting plans that don't work. So largely looking at media influences, it's become even harder because these kids are growing up with media. Our brains process images much faster than we can words, and so when these teenage girls and boys are scrolling through any type of social media platform, they're quickly comparing their bodies to these unrealistic, highly filtered and photoshopped pictures. That can cause a lot of issues. We also have these articles, right, that is promoting for teenagers to get an insane body. And what's so crazy about this particular title is then you have this other little story of how she finally beat the eating disorder that ripped her life apart. So it is a dichotomy and it contradicts one another because this magazine is promoting to get an insane body, but yet at the same time recognizing that this really does cause disordered eating. So it's important to help prevent all of this. So let's talk about the different eating disorders. There are 4 main categories, and there's these other non-diagnosable eating disorders as well. You may not have a full-blown eating disorder, but I think everybody has some sort of disordered eating pattern, and some maybe don't have anything at all. Anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, orthorexia, and binge eating are the 4 primary eating disorders that we'll briefly discuss. I first want to share some of the common personality traits among people who have eating disorders. Low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy or lack of control, fear of becoming fat, depressed, anxious, angry, or feelings of loneliness, perfectionism, and achievement-oriented people. These tend to be the highest and most common personality traits among people who have eating disorders. But it's not to say that if you don't have these personality traits, you're not at risk for developing an eating disorder. Nationally, there's 20 million women with eating disorders and 10 million men with eating disorders. Eating disorders is the #1 reason for mental illness deaths. So let's look at the first eating disorder, which is anorexia nervosa. This picture in the upper left-hand column can represent someone who is experiencing anorexia nervosa. They typically have body dysmorphia. Body dysmorphia is essentially when you look in the mirror and you see someone who weighs 300 and 400 pounds, but in reality you weigh 90 pounds. Anorexia nervosa is classified as an extremely limited caloric intake per day. A lot of these people are eating under 500 calories per day, or maybe not even eating that many. Anorexia means loss of appetite. So when we add the nervosa, this is when it's classified as the eating disorder of severely restricting caloric intake. Bulimia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is represented by the picture on the bottom right side. Bulimia nervosa is classified as any type of purge. So essentially, when this person will eat food, they then go and purge or force themselves to throw up in order to burn off those calories or not have those calories absorbed. Another form of bulimia nervosa can be an exercise abuse. So what that means is they'll eat a cookie and then they'll go and get on the treadmill until it says that they burned 500 calories. Now, it's important to note that you can have a combination of all of these eating disorders, and you might not just exclusively fall into one category. Orthorexia is another type of eating disorder, which is represented in the bottom left-hand column picture. Orthorexia is the obsession with the quality of their food intake, not the quantity. So they have extreme food rules on what is and is not allowed according to whatever standard they've developed in their brain. For example, this girl in this picture wouldn't dare eat a cheeseburger because that's not healthy. And if her produce isn't completely organic and non-GMO, then there's no way she's going to eat it. This is a heavily debated eating disorder classification because people say they're just trying to get healthy. Oftentimes, this eating disorder can be hard to diagnose because people will just be on this, quote, lifestyle improvement. However, it's important to identify that when orthorexia and the thoughts of food consume your life for day to day, that's when it's the issue. So I'm all for everybody trying to eat a little bit healthier, but when it impacts your day-to-day living, that's when it is considered an eating disorder. Finally, binge eating. Binge eating is when a person will eat and consume a large quantity of food in one setting. This can be their way that they're coping or dealing with emotions or stress. Oftentimes, binge eaters do this in secret, and they may have, for example, a whole carton of chocolate chip cookies in their car that they hide and they eat at the end of every day because they don't want anybody to know about them. This is another classification for eating disorders. So this graph shows you the lifetime prevalence of eating disorders, and it's categorized by males and females. So the females are in green and the males are in blue. And what you can notice right away is there's more green than blue. So yes, traditionally women do have higher prevalences of eating disorders. However, it's important to note that males also experience eating disorders. And there are likely more than what is represented in this graphic because men may not admit to it. As I was saying, males are often an overlooked population when we're looking at eating disorders. A lot of times that's because females are typically classified with that eating disorder because of their goal is to be thin. Where males, their pressure is to have more muscle. So yeah, there are fewer instances than females, but I really just feel like they just don't talk about it as much. Men that are at the highest risk of developing an eating disorder are those that are involved in sports, modeling, and entertainment. Basically, any type of pressure to maintain a certain weight or shape. Again, like I said, the eating disorders typically stem from females for a desire to be thin and for males for a desire to be more muscular. One other area that's important to note is the female athlete triad. The female athlete triad is a terrible trifecta. So what happens with the female athlete triad? First, she has low energy availability because she exercises a lot, whether it's for a particular sport or just because she enjoys to exercise. And it's coupled with disordered eating. So you have a high energy expenditure, so basically you're burning a lot of calories, plus not eating enough calories. Once that happens, our body goes into, as females, amenorrhea. So we stop having our period every month. With our periods, we produce estrogen, and estrogen is an important hormone in bone health. So after we stop having a period, because our body is basically going into survival mode, we then get pre-osteoporosis prematurely. So we have a significant amount of bone loss. So for example, a female athlete triad, she could basically be walking along, she could bump her hip on the corner of a table, and it could actually break her bones. That's how brittle they become due to this disordered eating coupled with an extreme high athletic performance. So one of the things that has been heavily studied is how body image then impacts the eating disorder risk. So when someone is not feeling so good about their bodies, they tend to develop unhealthy relationships with food in order to basically make their body whatever image that they're wanting to. So I like this picture because on the left-hand side here, it says something that's healthy versus the right-hand side is something that's unhealthy. So these in between in the blue are kind of some danger zones that we want to make sure that we stay out of. So we want to exercise to be healthy. We want to fuel our bodies with good nourishing foods, but we don't want it to become an obsession to where food is defining us or we're feeling really guilty after we're eating or we have these strict food rules. That then is when we go into that disordered eating and then potentially a full-blown eating disorder. A lot of this stems from the diet culture that we live in. There's constantly a new diet, a new fad, a new shake, a new pill that is promoting weight loss. So what happens is this diet binge cycle. We basically start a diet which has some type of restriction on it, whether it's low carb, low fat, or whatever the latest and greatest diet is. This then makes us become preoccupied with food cravings. So for example, you're going to cut out sugar in your diet, right? So that's the restriction, no sugar. So then you become preoccupied with chocolate chip cookies and ice cream and cake. So you've been really good all week and you go over to your girlfriend's house and she made brownies, but you've been really good. You haven't had any sugar this week. So you decide you're going to have a little piece of that brownie. So you break the diet restriction. Well, then you feel failed, you feel shame, you feel like you are not good enough, and there's this black and white thinking. But there's a lot of gray area in nutrition that's important to remember. But because you've been restricting, now you feel like a failure. You feel so much shame, so now you're going to binge and overeat. So now you've eaten half of the pan of the brownies, and now you feel even more guilty, and you believe that losing weight will make things better, and so the diet starts again on Monday. Do you see how bad this is for our overall mental health? In addition, yo-yo dieting wreaks havoc on our metabolic pathways. Oftentimes, we're so obsessed about what the outer appearance looks like, we don't even think about the damage that it's doing under the hood. This is an important thing to try to move away from. Eating disorders thrive in this diet culture and the diet mentality. We want to try to move to this idea that everybody is healthy no matter what size your body is. Health at every size is this idea that it doesn't matter what the weight is as long as you have healthy behaviors such as enjoying your food and providing some nourishing foods mostly in your diet, but also allowing those fun play foods. In diet culture, the eating disorders are going to thrive, and this is when you start to think about food as being deserved or you worked hard enough for it or whatever idea that you have and rule that you've put in your brain that allows you to eat or not eat certain foods. So we want to allow foods into our diet and not take anything off limits or restrict. This is the non-diet mentality. So this is creating space for us to become more aware of how we're fueling our body and what foods make our bodies feel good. So some steps that we can do is we can help change the language when we look at our bodies and food. We first want to make sure that the kitchen is stocked with mostly healthy foods, but then also some of those play foods. So if at the end of the night you want to have a chocolate chip cookie, then I'll go for it. It's when we don't have those chocolate chip cookies all day, every day. We don't want to label foods as good or bad. So we don't want to say that, well, chocolate chip cookies are bad and broccoli is good. Because when we eat that said bad food, then we're going to feel bad about ourselves. We can't put a moral value on food. It's really important to move away from these languages. I like to use the word as nourishing, so I have foods that are nourishing or health-giving, and then I have my play foods. So my play foods would be what we would call the, quote, bad foods in society. We also don't want to mention weight in conversations. This is a pivotal moment because anytime you're commenting on somebody's weight, you're then putting an emphasis on their weight. So this also includes yourself. So if you were someone who grew up in a household where your parents said they were overweight or they were fat, that then makes you think about your own body. So we want to make sure that we can focus on the positives of our body. So what does my body do for me on a daily basis? How can I move? Focus on that over the weight on the scale. That can make a big impact. I would recommend for you to check out more about intuitive eating if this is something that you've struggled with your relationship with food. We can change our self-talk and how we approach food and body by changing the language of how we speak to ourselves and others in relationship to our body and food. So in summary, I want to mention that it's important to have foods that nourish our bodies, but for it to not become an obsession. I took this picture a while ago off of the social media where they had the races and ethnicities listed underneath. And so I changed them to body style. So like overweight, thin, obese, normal weight, athletic, dad bod, and bodybuilder. And I just want to emphasize that, we want to enjoy the body size that was determined by genetics, because wasting our life to achieve unrealistic expectations will most likely kill us sooner.